Welcome to today's hearing. Today's hearing is a chance for members to check up on the implementation of Medicare Access and CHIP Reauthorization Act of 2015, more commonly known as MACRA. I believe we're in a better place now than we were prior to 2015 because of the work done by the members of the Energy and Commerce Committee, led by Dr. Burgess, to get MACRA enacted into law with overwhelming bipartisan support. MACRA charted a new course for Medicare and attempted to put it on a more sustainable financial path. MACRA was designed to shift physician reimbursements from a fee-for-service payment model to one that seeks to reward doctors for value over volume for patient care. One of the biggest pieces was the elimination of the Sustainable Growth Rate, or SGR. This was the formula used to determine the annual updates to the Medicare fee schedule, which governs physician reimbursement. On top of eliminating the SGR, MACRA established the Quality Pay Program, which establishes two pathways to incentivize physicians to transition to value-based care. One pathway is the Merit-Based Incentive Payment System, or MIPS, where a provider is subject to a performance-based payment system that results in payment adjustments based on certain quality reporting categories. The other pathway is the Alternative Payment Model, or APMs, which allows physicians to take a risk-based approach to treating patients to achieve specific performance goals in order to receive bonus payments. This hearing will allow Congress to understand what's working, what's not working, what's showing promise, and what unexpected challenges have come to light. Among these unexpected challenges is CMS's implementation of MACRA that has created additional levels of administrative complexity and costs. This has slowed down the adoption of MACRA's quality payment programs. Savings achieved under these models have also been less than was hoped for, and CMS's process for approving new payment models has been something of a disappointment as well. In 2020, less than 238,000 providers were participating in APMs, while over 933,000 participated in MIPS. MIPS has also proven administratively complex to implement and costly for providers. This has disadvantaged small and rural healthcare providers and in many instances prevented them from participating in the program on a level playing field. It is essential that these rural and underserved providers are not left at a disadvantage due to the lack of resources and infrastructure. A small rural practice needs standards that are relevant to their practice and different than the larger suburban practices. These issues risk further accelerating the consolidation of healthcare providers. We've seen too often doctors are forced to pay attention to certain metrics to ensure reimbursement rather than for quality patient care. We must strike the right balance between fairly compensating our doctors and healthcare providers to ensure access to high-quality care while also being good stewards of Medicare funds. I will now yield the remainder of my time to a leader on this issue, Dr. Burgess.
Well, I thank the chairman, and as he pointed out, the SGR's unrealistic expectations of spending and efficiency affected the healthcare profession and Medicare beneficiaries for nearly 17 years before the final repeal. At the time, docs were facing a 24% cut in Medicare rates unless Congress stepped in to provide a more straightforward reimbursement system for America's physicians. The Medicare Access and CHIP Reauthorization Act introduced the new merit-based incentive payment system and processes to adopt alternative payment models. This new system shifted the approach to physician payment, paying providers based on quality, value, and the results of care delivered rather than just the number of patients seen in a day. I've dedicated a large part of my congressional career to repealing and replacing the Sustainable Growth Rate formula, and obviously the follow-on, the enactment of the Medicare Access and CHIP Reauthorization Act. This was a major milestone in 2015 and was supported by over 800 healthcare organizations, overwhelming support in both the House and the Senate when it passed. This legislation was the result of bipartisan multi-committee negotiations that produced legislative responses to some of our nation's most pressing healthcare issues. It is important to note that we were solving the problems of the time and that our shared goal was to help doctors and their patients be relieved from the constant threat of payment cuts and doctors dropping out of the system. The repeal of the SGR took me personally 13 years from start to finish, With a product as comprehensive and complex as MACRA, it was short-sighted of Congress to assume that the need for oversight would stop after the signing ceremony. I thank the chairman for this opportunity to examine what worked and what didn't work, the agency's role in implementation, and how we can make it easier for doctors to practice in our healthcare system. Our work is far from done, and docs deserve a long-term financial stability, and patients deserve access to the best care possible. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back to you.
Gentleman yields back, and I yield back as well, and now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Castor, for a 5-minute opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairman Griffith, for holding this important oversight hearing on the Medicare Access and CHIP Reauthorization Act, or MACRA. Welcome to our witnesses. Thank you for your expert advice to the committee. Our older neighbors and other patients who rely on Medicare deserve health care that is affordable, accessible, and high quality. MACRA was passed in 2015 with strong bipartisan support to resolve problems created by the sustainable growth rate formula that had frustrated Congress and providers for years. MACRA attempted to replace that system with one that rewarded physicians for providing high-quality care rather than a high volume of care. And so I appreciate the approach that we're taking today to solicit feedback from those who have direct experience providing care to Medicare beneficiaries and those who have studied the impact over time. The two new payment models established under MACRA were designed to shift away from costly Medicare fee-for-service reimbursements by creating incentives for physicians to provide more value-based care. The first payment model, the Merit-Based Incentives Payment System, or MIPS, established performance bonuses or reductions for eligible physicians based on progress on a selection of metrics, including the cost and quality of the care they provide. The second payment model in MACRA created incentives for Medicare physicians to voluntarily participate in advanced alternative payment models that include accountable care organizations or bundled payment structures for specialized care. These APMs must show economic efficiency and meet certain patient thresholds to qualify physicians for the APM bonuses. Both payment models have had mixed results. The Medicare Payment Advisory Commission, or MedPAC, has reported to Congress that MIPS does not adequately measure physician performance because the assessments for individual providers vary based upon which metrics they choose to report. And not enough providers appear to be adopting the APMs in the way that we had hoped when MACRA was passed. So what are we going to do about it? Well, to adequately pay physicians for improving the quality of care they provide to our neighbors who rely on Medicare, we need to be confident that the measures we use to assess and compare performance are meaningful and incentivize physicians to participate in these new payment models. The process of monitoring and improving current methods of assessing quality of care at Medicare physician payment systems is ongoing, and I hope that this hearing today will be a productive part of those efforts. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services has launched a number of initiatives to ensure that our older neighbors who rely on Medicare are able to access excellent care when and where they need it. These include investing in greater participation in APMs that demonstrate patient benefits and cost savings to serve more patients, particularly in rural and other underserved areas. These are certainly policy pushes in a positive direction, but we need your input to go farther. As MACRA has been in effect since 2017, this is a very good time to assess how the reforms have lived up to the original legislative goals and what we can learn from the experiences of doctors and patients in our communities back home. That's why it's so important to hear from experts like you. I encourage other stakeholders out there monitoring this hearing to weigh in as well. I look forward to hearing all of your testimony today on this important issue that has implications for the well-being of 60 million of Americans who rely on Medicare for their health and well-being. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. Now recognize the gentlelady from Washington, the chair of the full committee, Ms. McMorris Rogers, for her 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Griffith. This committee is actively working on bipartisan solutions to enhance transparency and reduce healthcare cost. We moved a bipartisan health package through the full committee unanimously last month, and we're now focusing on how current laws facilitate quality care for American seniors. That's what we sought to do when Congress passed MACRA in 2015 in a bipartisan manner, and I want to join in thanking Dr. Burgess for his leadership on that effort. MACRA, which replaced the sustainable growth rate formula, brought stability to the medical provider community. For decades, the traditional Medicare fee-for-service system inadvertently incentivized the proliferation of low-value healthcare services by paying for volume rather than health outcomes for patients. When seniors visited their doctors, they often received a multiple of services that may not have been necessary for their health, simply because the system rewarded quantity rather than the quality of care. MACRA introduced a new approach that is prioritizing quality over quantity. The Quality Payment Program, consisting of the Merit-Based Incentive Payment Program and the Advanced Alternative Payment Models, aim to streamline reporting measures and reduce administrative burdens on providers, allowing doctors to dedicate more time to patient care. Today's hearing will deepen our understanding of MACRA's implementation and help us address remaining barriers to optimal patient care. Our work becomes more urgent as more Americans age into the Medicare program, and the financial and regulatory pressures on healthcare providers inside and outside of Medicare mount. We must pay special attention to the challenges faced by doctors in rural areas, such as my district in Eastern Washington. We've learned throughout this committee's process to address healthcare cost and transparency. Outdated Medicare payment policies and rules can lead to regulatory capture, which encourages greater healthcare consolidation that leads to higher prices for patients and reduced quality of care. The impact of MACRA on rural healthcare providers has been significant, and small practices in these areas may face large burdens in transitioning to value-based payment arrangements, which may be leading to further provider consolidation. Our rural healthcare providers are integral to the health of our communities, but they continue to grapple with financial and technological hurdles. Despite these challenges, they've shown remarkable resilience and commitment to providing quality care to our constituents. Our goal today is to learn more about where improvements are needed to ensure rural healthcare providers can further improve the delivery of care. MACRA has also presented challenges to specialists and small practices which may not have the resources to build a model of their own or balance the financial trade-offs. Take, for example, the oncology care model and the successor model for enhancing oncology model, which are alternative payment models focused on caring for Medicare patients undergoing chemotherapy. These models aim to improve the quality of care for cancer patients by encouraging oncologists to coordinate care, make evidence-based treatment decisions, and engage patients in their care, all with the goal of enhancing the patient's overall experience and health. While in some ways these models were a step forward, they've also highlighted areas where we need to improve. This includes how to better align payment incentives and regulatory flexibilities to deliver cost savings and better health outcomes for patients, as well as the uncertainty that comes with models being phased in and out as administrations change. Another key issue we must address is the financial strain on our providers. It is concerning to note that when adjusted for inflation and practice cost, physicians' pay within Medicare has declined 22% from 2001 to 2021. And at the same time, the cost of running a medical practice has increased nearly 40%. This financial pressure is a significant barrier to the adoption of value-based care models, and we must think creatively about how to alleviate that pressure and encourage adoption of innovative payment policies like the ones I've previously described. As we continue this hearing, let's remember that our goal is to ensure that MACRA is implemented in a way that benefits both American seniors and our healthcare providers. I'm confident that this committee can continue to lead with bipartisan solutions to lower costs for patients and strengthen our healthcare system. Thank you, and I continue to look forward to the discussion. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for his 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we're examining the impact of the Medicare Access and CHIP Reauthorization Act, or MACRA. When MACRA was passed on a bipartisan basis 8 years ago, there was hope that it would create a system for reliable Medicare payments to healthcare providers based on the quality of care that patients received. Before its passage, Congress consistently needed to intervene to adjust ever-decreasing payment rates for providers. The goal of MACRA was to stop that roller coaster of payment cuts and encourage new approaches for payment systems. It also includes additional incentives for better care for Medicare beneficiaries and a reliable system that did not require constant congressional intervention. And these are all worthy goals, but it's fair to say that we have not seen the results that many of us had hoped for. A fundamental portion of MACRA was the merit-based incentive payment system. This system was intended to provide better pay for healthcare providers who provided better care. And this was and is a laudable goal. We want doctors and other providers to always have patient well-being at the core of their practice, but in reality, this system has appeared to create additional administrative burdens for providers without producing significant improvements in patient care. Examinations from both the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission and the Government Accountability Office have come to the same conclusion. However, there are other avenues for improvement of the Medicare physician payment system. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, is working to increase participation in alternative payment models that can provide bonuses to physicians who take on a certain amount of financial risk for the quality of patient care. And I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about how these alternative payment models have affected experiences and outcomes for both physicians and patients. And I also want to hear how they can provide the greatest benefits going forward. Establishing a system that increases accountability and efficiency while maintaining quality patient care is a vision we must continue to pursue. The challenge before this committee and Congress is ensuring that Medicare remains viable while ensuring that patients receive quality care and doctors receive fair compensation. And we need to make sure that any changes we make help us better evaluate the quality of care that patients are receiving without overwhelming physicians with administrative requirements. At the end of the day, any discussion on changes to Medicare physician payment systems must prioritize access to high-quality care for all Medicare beneficiaries when and where they need it. It's now been 8 years since MACRA was enacted, and this is a good opportunity for us to examine what we've learned from the experience of both patients and physicians in the Medicare program. I appreciate the witnesses for testifying today and providing their thoughts on how we can ensure sustainable quality care for America's seniors. I hope that today's hearing can give us a bipartisan path forward to improve the system, and look forward to working with my colleagues on that going forward. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. That concludes members' opening statements. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to the committee rules, all members' written opening statements will be made a part of the record, but please make sure you provide those written opening statements to the clerk promptly so that we can get that put into the record in the appropriate place. We want to thank our witnesses for being here today and taking time to testify before our subcommittee. Thank you. You will have an opportunity to give an opening statement, followed by a round of questions from members. Our witnesses today are Joe Albanese, who is the policy analyst at the Paragon Institute, Aisha Pittman, Senior Vice President at the National Association of ACOs, Daghestani, Chair of the Board of America's Physician Groups and CEO of the Austin Regional Clinic in Texas, and finally, J. Michael McWilliams, the Warren Alpert Foundation Professor of Healthcare Policy at Harvard Medical School and a Professor of Medicine and practicing general internist at Brigham and Women's Hospital. We appreciate you all being here today, and I look forward to hearing from you. This is the Energy and Commerce Committee and the Subcommittee on Oversight. We're holding an oversight hearing today, and when doing so, we have the practice of taking our testimony under oath. Do any of you have an objection to testifying under oath? Seeing that no one has objected, we'll proceed. The chair would also advise you that you're entitled to be advised by counsel pursuant to House rules. Do any of you desire to be advised by counsel during your testimony today? All right, I'm seeing that none have indicated that they wish to be represented by counsel today. So accordingly, if you would please rise and raise your right hand. Do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? All have, the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. You may be seated. And you are now sworn in and under oath, subject to the penalties set forth in Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code. With that, we will now recognize Mr. Albanese for 5 minutes to give an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Griffith, Ranking Member Castor, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the Medicare Access and CHIP Reauthorization Act of 2015, or MACRA. I'm a senior policy analyst at Paragon Health Institute, a think tank dedicated to empowering patients and reforming government programs. Providing high-quality health care to Medicare beneficiaries while maintaining fiscal sustainability has been a long-standing goal for policymakers. MACRA was an attempt to achieve that goal. I recently authored a paper for Paragon titled MACRA, Medicare's Fitful Quest for Value-Based Care. This paper serves as the basis of my testimony, which reflects my own views. Today, I intend to make two main points. First, despite the good intentions of policymakers, MACRA has not solved the issues with how Medicare pays doctors. Second, MACRA's value-based care programs have not significantly improved the quality of healthcare services. MACRA has two key components for Medicare. First, it set a schedule of statutory payment updates for physicians and other clinicians in Medicare, including a pay freeze between 2020 and 2025. Second, it created a quality payment program. The quality payment program, in turn, has two tracks. Under the first track, the Merit-Based Incentive Payment System, or MIPS, participating clinicians receive rewards or penalties based on their performance on certain quality metrics. Under the second track, clinicians receive annual bonuses for participating in advanced alternative payment models, or APMs. These APMs test new ways of reimbursing providers to incentivize greater value. MACRA came in response to real problems in Medicare. In 2015, Congress's existing mechanism for controlling clinician spending, the Sustainable Growth Rate Formula, had not been enforced in over a decade, and the cumulative payment cuts required by it were untenable. MACRA's payment updates did help to slow the growth of clinician spending relative to other Part B services. The rationale behind the quality payment program is also understandable. The consensus among policymakers then, as now, was that Medicare's fee-for-service reimbursement structure does not incentivize quality improvement. The quality payment program streamlined and expanded existing efforts to pay clinicians for value rather than the volume of care. However, problems have still emerged from the MACRA framework. Congress has overridden MACRA's scheduled payment updates numerous times to boost doctors' fees. This raises questions as to whether MACRA's payments are sustainable in the long run. Meanwhile, the quality payment program has not improved value, which economists at Yale have recently confirmed in a recently released review. For example, clinicians can pick their own measures to report in MIPS, which allows them to hide poor performance and is part of why 4/5 of participants achieve exceptional performance. At the same time, complying with MIPS's complex reporting requirements has been administratively costly, particularly for small practices. The result is a burdensome program that is unhelpful for incentivizing actual quality improvement. APMs have also been disappointing. The federal body responsible for most of them, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, predates MACRA and has over a decade of experience designing and managing APMs. Yet the Innovation Center has found that only 6 out of its more than 50 APMs have yielded net savings, and only 2 of those have seen significant quality improvements. I will close with 2 more key points. First, Medicare is in a tenuous fiscal situation. According to CBO, Medicare spending is already expected to nearly double from $820 billion in 2023 to $1.6 trillion in 2033. This is the single biggest financing challenge that the federal government faces. Changes to payment policy should not worsen this fiscal situation. Second, policymakers should reevaluate their approach to value-based care. Value is a worthy goal that everyone wants to achieve, but is difficult to measure. Policymakers should consider that patients themselves are best positioned to judge how they value their own care, often in consultation with their doctors. Sophisticated metrics and payment incentives that reflect the priorities of government technocrats will not necessarily translate into innovations that are relevant to patients. Congress can play a key role in examining MACRA's design and the decisions made during its implementation. It is important to learn the right lessons made during this implementation, avoid past missteps, and empower patients to access the best quality care. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank the gentleman, and now recognize Ms. Pittman for her 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Griffin, Chair Rogers, Ranking Member Castor, and Ranking Member Pallone, and members of the subcommittee and full committee. I'm honored to be here to represent the more than 400 accountable care organizations that are working to improve quality of care for patients and reduce healthcare costs. Accountable care organizations, or ACOs, bring together clinicians, hospitals, and other providers to innovate care while being held accountable for the clinical outcomes and cost of a population. With primary care as a backbone, ACOs employ a team-based approach to provide patient-centered care. The National Association of ACOs members serve over 8 million beneficiaries in Medicare value-based payment models, including the Medicare Shared Savings Program. ACOs are a voluntary approach that has been a good financial investment for taxpayers, clinicians, and patients. In the last decade, ACOs have generated more than $17 billion in savings, with $6.4 billion being returned to Medicare, all while maintaining high quality for patients. Thank you for holding this hearing to address MACRA. One of the goals of MACRA was to provide financial incentives for clinicians to join alternative payment models, or APMs. MACRA provides a 5% incentive payment for clinicians that adopt risk-bearing APMs. This incentive is an effective tool to attract clinicians to APMs and has increased participation. Additionally, the incentives allow clinicians to reinvest in their practices and patient care. ACOs account for the majority of Medicare's advanced APMs and have used these incentives to hire care managers to provide personal care to their sickest patients, provide transportation and meals, invest in technology, create 24/7 phone lines so that patients can call their primary care provider rather than seeking emergency care. These are services that cannot be reimbursed through Medicare, but improve patient health outcomes and well-being. While APMs are transforming how patients in traditional Medicare receive care, adoption of value models has been slower than originally predicted due to misaligned incentives, challenges in APM implementation, and time needed for clinicians and providers to redesign care processes. MACRA was a step in the right direction, but more needs to be done to drive long-term system transformation. Congress should take the following actions to accelerate the adoption of value-based care. First, extend the MACRA 5% advanced APM incentives, which are set to expire at the end of this year. The incentives have proven to be a successful tool for recruiting new providers into APMs and give additional resources to providers to innovate care. Second, redesign the physician payment incentives to promote value. The current approach is complex, and clinicians who remain in fee-for-service potentially have the highest incentives. A long-term approach should ensure that clinicians receive adequate payment updates, with any additional incentives reserved for clinicians who move to APMs. More broadly, we should also establish incentives for all other providers receiving Medicare payment. Third, we must improve the non-financial incentives for value by removing barriers to participation and giving additional flexibility to innovate care. This includes removing distinctions that penalize rural and safety net providers, improving financial benchmarks so that APM participants are not penalized for their own success, expanding waivers that support patient care, and providing technical assistance for clinicians new to APMs. Fourth, work with the CMS Innovation Center to ensure that promising models have a more predictable pathway for becoming permanent. Few models have met the criteria for expansion, but many models have highlighted valuable lessons for improving care. We should revisit the expansion criteria to account for factors like expanding participation to more types of providers and retaining access in rural or other vulnerable communities. Finally, provide parity between APMs and the Medicare Advantage program. Like ACOs, risk arrangements between providers and health plans allow for care innovations and offer a pathway for moving to payment approaches other than fee-for-service. We need greater alignment to ease provider burden and ensure that both APMs and MA are attractive and sustainable options. These two programs should be more similar in their benchmarks and flexibilities that improve patient care. In closing, ACOs and other APMs have demonstrated that when clinicians and other providers come together to innovate care, we lower costs and improve care. We should explore all avenues to continue to bolster these arrangements. Thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, Ms. Pittman. Now recognize Dr. Daghestani for his 5-minute opening statement.
Good morning, Chair Griffith, Subcommittee Ranking Member Castor, and other distinguished members. Thank you for this opportunity to testify. My name is Daghestani. I'm a practicing primary care physician and board specialized in internal medicine. I come here as the chair of the board of America's Physician Groups, or APG, as well as the chief executive officer of Austin Regional Clinic. APG is a national organization representing approximately 360 physician groups in 45 states. Our members provide coordinated, integrated, patient-centric care that is accountable.
Let me interrupt you for just a second. The technical folks are telling me if you could move your mic a little bit closer so the C-SPAN folks can hear you. We could, but the C-SPAN folks may not be able to hear you as well. And we froze the time, so you're okay on time. If you want to back up a little bit, you can.
Thank you.
All right.
APG is a national organization representing approximately 360 physician groups in 45 states. Our members provide coordinated, integrated, patient-centric care that is accountable for cost and quality. We engage in full spectrum of alternative payment model and Medicare Advantage. Collectively, APG groups employ or contract with approximately 195,000 physicians and care for nearly 45 million patients. APG groups also take care of 1.5 million in Medicare ACOs and nearly 10 million in Medicare Advantage. Austin Regional Clinic is a multi-specialty group that started 43 years ago. It's physician-owned, physician-led, and physician-governed. It is started by 2 family medicine physicians, a pediatrician, an OB-GYN, and a general surgeon and a pediatrician coming together with the idea that we need to be organized, we need to be in a multi-specialty setting to be able to deliver good care. Dial 43 years later, we're 400 primary care physicians and specialists, 2,500 employees. We take care of 650,000 patients in the area, including over 55,000 Medicare and Medicare Advantage patients. I have 3 main points to cover today. First, MACRA constituted a great step forward when enacted in 2015 because it repealed the unworkable sustainable growth rate SGR formula and moved beyond the fee-for-service payment for clinicians unrelated to quality or cost concern. It introduced a new merit-based incentive payment, MIPS, and built on existing structure of alternative payment model, including through planned physician-focused payment model. These changes created the incentives for clinicians to improve care for Medicare beneficiary while being attentive to cost. Adjusted for inflation, my second point is that all of these positive features for MACRA have had mixed success. Adjusted for inflation, Medicare payment to physician has fallen 26% from 2001 to 2023. MACRA's helpful incentive have not altered this picture of declining payment. Given shortage of primary care doctors and other healthcare organization workers and rapid price inflation, the financial pressure on many practices are growing. Many lack the capacity for technology and other infrastructure investment to fundamentally transform healthcare. These and other pressures are contributing to the consolidation among physician practice, a phenomena with which this committee has been appropriately concerned. Despite best intention, the MIPS program has failed to drive sufficient improvement in quality and cost. MIPS assume that motivating individual physician to do better will lead to improved quality and optimal resource use, even if, as of now the case, only half of the doctors participate. In fact, it takes groups of clinicians and multiple aspects of the healthcare system, not just doctors, operating in the right incentive to transform healthcare. This reality leads to my third point. MACRA should be re-engineered to fully fuel the transition to value-based healthcare that has broad bipartisan support in Congress for nearly 2 decades. Although overall Medicare saving from accountable care organization has been low, participating by physician group is positively associated with saving. I currently serve as the chair of medical officer of Seton Health Alliance, and an ACO in partnership with Ascension Seton Healthcare Family. In 2018, our ACO generated top quality result and $10 million in saving. An example is I had a patient in clinic who've had 65 ER visits in 1 year, every Saturday of the year and few others. They were mostly for insecurities: access to medication, access to health care, and access to food and access to transportation. I worked with the patient, with our nursing staff, with many others in the community to address many issues, including medication support, food security, social services. 1 year later, the patient had 20 office visits and 12 ER. Patient got much better care, holistic care. The cost was lower, but this cost cannot be recouped through the current Medicare fee-for-service claims. The patient at the end did much better from a quality, but again, the cost was not recouped. Unfortunately, these value-based care models face headwind that policymakers should address. In my written testimony, I advanced 5 critical solutions, but in the interest of time, I'll focus only on one. The current structure of MACRA should be replaced with far greater incentive and possibly mandatory requirement to move to primary care capitation and total risk and global capitation Medicare. For practices new to value-based care, policymakers should dramatically increase upfront payment for infrastructure and technology, especially for small physician practices in rural area and those serving vulnerable population. The alternative is likely to be more likely primary care deserts and ongoing practice consolidation. The looming fiscal crunch that will ensue from rising healthcare spending and the declining health status of many Americans create a burning platform for change. We at APG and Austin Regional Clinic look forward to working with you further to advance improvement in the U.S. healthcare for benefit of patients, provider, and taxpayer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And the gentleman yields back. Thank you. Dr. McWilliams, you're now recognized for your 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Griffith, Ranking Member Castor, members of the subcommittee and full committee. Thank you for holding this hearing today and inviting me to testify on the status of MACRA. My name is Michael McWilliams. I'm a professor of healthcare policy and professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and a physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital. I also serve as a senior advisor to the CMS Innovation Center. My testimony today reflects my own views and focuses on 2 major pieces of MACRA: the Advanced Alternative Payment Model, or APM bonus, and the Merit-Based Incentive Payment System, or MIPS. These payment reforms were intended to encourage the provision of efficient and high-quality care in the Medicare program. These are important goals, and the reforms were well-intended, but their effectiveness has been limited. The problems are ones of design, addressable in the case of the APM bonus, but more intractable in the case of the MIPS. Taking a step back, Medicare looks much different than it did when MACRA was enacted. Over half of eligible beneficiaries are now enrolled in the rapidly growing Medicare Advantage, or MA program, and while much of the care in traditional Medicare is now provided in promising APMs such as accountable care organizations, or ACOs, participation in those models has stalled in recent years, and traditional Medicare is shrinking. Particularly with the APM bonus set to expire next year, ending a key provision that was to encourage participation in APMs, it's a good time to take stock of MACRA and how its provisions could be restructured to better advance the goals of payment reform in Medicare. My testimony makes 6 main points. First, APMs are promising and worth encouraging. APMs are our best hope for managing spending in traditional Medicare in a way that produces the most value for beneficiaries, particularly population-based payment models, or ACOs. Not only do APMs discourage unnecessary care, they also give providers more flexibility to deliver care in ways that best meet patient needs by setting payments that encompass all of a patient's care and limiting fee-for-service incentives that otherwise interfere by requiring clinicians to select specific services over others in order to get paid. That flexibility is really crucial for providers to follow their intrinsic motivation and respond to market demand for better care. and the evidence on APMs is generally encouraging. Savings have been modest, but second, the design of APMs has hampered their success. Because APMs have been largely voluntary, it has been challenging to move away from fee-for-service rapidly. In my written testimony, I detail how design issues have weakened incentives to participate and save in APMs. With recent changes to the Medicare Shared Savings Program that take effect next year, I believe that program, which is the largest APM, is now on the right track. But it has taken time, and now the APM bonus created by MACRA is set to expire at a critical juncture in APM evolution. Third, for that reason, I believe the APM bonus should be extended, but also restructured to be more effective. To date, the bonus has been structured as a proportion of provider fee-for-service revenue, which favors higher revenue organizations and incentivizes more revenue, more costly care, undermining a main goal of APMs. The bonus has also been restricted to so-called advanced APMs with downside financial risk. But we now know that lower revenue organizations have produced savings without downside risk and should be encouraged to participate too. For these reasons, I recommend the APM bonus be structured as a flat per beneficiary sum, independent of provider revenue, and broadened to include ACO contracts with no downside risk. Fourth, the MIPS has been a costly failure. In fact, I don't recall a more uniformly and resoundingly critiqued payment policy in my career. Many, including MedPAC, have called for its elimination, and I agree with that recommendation. I won't belabor the many flaws now, but would point out that several are actually deep, intractable problems that would plague any pay-for-performance program and should caution us against even a scaled-back version of the MIPS. We now have over a decade of evidence on Medicare pay-for-performance programs demonstrating minimal benefits and costly unintended consequences. In sum, it should not be at the center of congressional efforts to improve the quality of care delivery. Instead, fifth, other strategies to support high-quality care should be prioritized. These include building better data systems to support providers and promoting competition. Competition exerts the primary external check on provider quality, as unhappy patients or unhappy clinicians can vote with their feet. These strategies may be beyond the scope of this hearing, but I note them to make the point that eliminating the MIPS is not conceding defeat. Finally, any discussion of Medicare reform must consider the implications of Medicare Advantage's rapid growth. As MA grows, and if APMs resume their growth, the MIPS will soon become obsolete and unworkable as the residual population becomes too small to support it. As MA grows, APMs also shrink. Thus, any discussion of the value and future of APMs begs for a discussion of the value and future of traditional Medicare, especially its role as a public option in facilitating regulation of MA and strengthening the Medicare program as a whole. Thank you again for inviting me to join you today. I look forward to your questions.
I thank all of you for your testimony. Wow, a lot of information in there to try to digest. We'll now move to the questioning phase, and I will begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. So many of my questions have in fact been answered, but I'm going to give you a chance, Ms. Pittman, to expand on what you think we need to be doing to get more alternative payment models working, because the transition has been, as all the witnesses seem to have said, slower than we envisioned. And can you tell us what factors have contributed to that slower adoption of APMs? And I know that's going to come back to the fee structure you were talking about in your testimony.
Yes, thank you for that question. So part of the slow adoption has been, one, just the COVID-19 pandemic. That is when we see a tapering off of more clinicians entering the models. You don't want to take risks when you're dealing with a lot of other issues. Beyond that, it gets to some of the challenges that are at the baseline of these alternative payment models. So having the adequate budget to address your patients, bringing other types of providers into the models. I mentioned both rural providers and specialists in my written testimonies. There are some things based in the models that make it challenging to bring on those types of providers. For rural providers, the focus there is access and not necessarily wanting to achieve savings. And so all of the alternative payment models have cost savings based into it. And so we might have to think of a different paradigm where for certain rural providers, you are giving them a baseline budget that doesn't have cuts on top of that as the ACO models do. If you take, for example, a critical access hospital, they are paid at cost. Even if you reduce the number of admissions to a critical access hospital, their their payment remains the same. It's really hard to put that in the framework of a shared savings approach. In terms of things that we can do to accelerate more providers into the models, one, it is to address some of the base framework with the models in terms of benchmarks and how you get more providers to participate. I think also I mentioned the incentive payments. That's a huge piece that has drawn more clinicians into the models. It's a huge incentive when our ACO members go out and try to recruit practices. Talking about this incentive payment is really a way that brings more clinicians to the model. Those incentive payments go directly back to the practice, not to the ACO, and those practices use it for innovating patient care. So one of the great examples that I've heard from a practice that is part of one of our members is they created this thing they call the BAT phone, the before all that phone. So with that phone, it is a 24/7 line that goes directly to someone in the practice. And instead of seeking emergency care, they ask all of the members of that practice to just call the BAT phone. And that has been incredibly successful. But that requires additional staff time, more staff to answer the phone. And so with that, in the absence of having these incentive payments, they wouldn't be able to do that. I think one of the challenges with the incentive payments that we would want to see addressed for the long term is thinking about how we sort of speed up the incentive over time. Right now, it's a 2-year delay, and if we could sort of shorten that time so that the practices get that money in hand faster, they can innovate care faster.
Thank you. Dr. McWilliams, I noticed you nodding your head on some of that. You want to agree, disagree, or expand?
I'd be happy to expand. I think I was nodding my head in regards to Ms. Pittman's comments on providers in rural areas, and I think those apply to any underserved population where the problem may not be so much overspending as underspending. One thing about alternative payment models that is appealing is it allows a more flexible mechanism by which payment can be rebalanced across populations to serve social goals. That's very hard to do in fee-for-service and is something that alternative payment models, by having a single benchmark covering total spending for population, can facilitate.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. So, Dr. Daghestani, what should CMS look at to ensure that the APM bonuses are reasonable enough to allow specialists, we've kind of touched on this, but to allow specialists to be included so collaboration between primary care and specialists is encouraged and rewarded? And I want you to, particularly because I'm running out of time, I want you to focus on how we do that in rural areas, because I serve a very large rural district and getting specialists is difficult in many of my counties.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So we're a multi-specialty group. I think there's an underestimation of the impact of specialists on the quality and the total cost of care. Primary care is extremely important as an access point, but a specialty has an impact on very complex care as well as the site of service. So I think practicing in rural Oklahoma before joining ARC, we only had 2 specialists. I practiced for 5 years, and we only had 2 specialists. We had to transfer everybody to the University of Oklahoma. Figuring out a financial model to incentivize specialists and to reward them to be in rural area and to be part of the ACO and participate in the shared saving is critical.
And I have to cut you off because I've run out of time, but if you could share any ideas with the committee on how we do that, I would greatly appreciate it. With that, I yield back and recognize Ms. Castor, the ranking member of the subcommittee, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, it's clear that there's a lot of room for improvement. I'm hearing a consensus that the MIPS has not been workable, that general consensus to extend the APM bonuses, extend that in a reauthorization. I'm also hearing some consensus on a frustration of just basic data gathering, being able to report what works. I'm a big fan of the importance of understanding the data. So, Dr. McWilliams, thank you for your very deep dive in your testimony. But you highlight this as a problem across the board, especially in rural and underserved areas. How do we get at that through an update to MACRA?
In terms of the data systems?
Yes.
Honestly, I'm not sure if it's part of that same legislative effort. I think it's important to take a step back and think about how we can support quality improvement. I think we've sort of leapt ahead of ourselves in trying to attach payment incentives to quality measures to try to do that. But there, as Representative Castor, you are alluding to, there is a lot we can do to build data systems to better support care for patients. That would be one of my general recommendations in terms of trying to start some initiatives in that regard. We know, for example, that when providers are better informed in various ways, that they do provide better care. Not always, but that is certainly helpful. I think, for example, of government efforts in a classic, playing a classic government role of solving collective action problems and building public goods, in constructing, for example, prescription drug monitoring programs in states, which has been a big advance. And those sort of systems, I think, supported by governments can be very helpful and provide, I know as a clinician myself, can provide invaluable information at the point of care. Also, understanding what works is very important.
Well, then let me ask Ms. Pittman, with all the ACOs, what has worked in being able to gather data on patients and quality?
Yeah, so in the ACO model, you actually are receiving more data than you would outside of the model. So the ACO receives data about where every part of the system that the beneficiary touches versus if you're not part of any APM, you only have that data for what you have in your particular practice. So this is a place where we've seen lots of benefits of being able to get the full set of claims data and see the full picture of a patient within the context of an ACO. And there has been a lot done to speed data over time. ACOs receive monthly files that give them all of the data for all of their aligned beneficiaries. There's work being done to speed that up. Everyone always wants it faster, but that is a place where there's been a real benefit from the programs.
Dr. Daghestani?
Yeah, I think MACRA have forced us to work together. So we do get data from claims, but also we're in a better position to get data from hospitals, from ERs, and from multiple sources and put all the data in one place so we have a more holistic approach at the patient. So that MACRA legislation, which was a catalyst for the movement, have really put us in a more work to move from a fragmented care to organized care. One of the potential solution for having rural area also is looking at state HIEs. I know in the state of Texas there is discussion about an HIE where everybody can submit information, then everybody has access to the data. And we've been engaged in that program as well and hoping that will yield some result. The challenges for that is the cost. So in a group like ARC, it is $22,000 per FTE cost of putting the IT infrastructure. That it's important for the quality of care, but it's a significant upfront investment.
So the long-term health of the Medicare Trust Fund is, we're in a very serious position, and then there's a recent report that Medicare Advantage is, all of the groups there are receiving significant overpayments. It was $75 billion, which was, I think, 3 times what MedPAC had projected. What do we need to consider here on MA as we update MACRA and move ahead, Dr. McWilliams?
I think this is an excellent question and probably the biggest one before us today in terms of Medicare reform. That's absolutely right that the payments to Medicare Advantage are well in excess of what we spend in traditional Medicare. Part of the reason for that additional spending, it seems, has been that has allowed us to expand benefits for seniors in the Medicare Advantage program, which is a worthy objective. However, one that we have not sort of addressed head-on or directly in Medicare reform. I'm certainly in favor of doing that more directly in the traditional Medicare program to expand the basic benefits package so that there is a good insurance program on both sides of Medicare. And in the process, that would allow us to engage in additional regulatory reforms to cut back on some of the overpayments, for example, for risk coding in Medicare Advantage, while preserving benefits largely in Medicare Advantage. Basically making traditional Medicare more of a viable competitor and therefore allowing us to regulate the Medicare Advantage program.
Good, and I'd ask the witnesses to submit an answer on that. We'll get that question out to you. Thank you. I yield back.
Generally yields back. Now recognize the chairwoman of the full committee, Ms. McMorris Rogers of Washington, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you all for being here. I represent 12 counties in eastern Washington. Much of my district is rural. So we live every day the challenges facing rural healthcare providers. And these challenges run from higher rates of chronic diseases to difficulties recruiting, retaining critical healthcare workers, to limited access to high-speed internet. As you know, these factors, coupled with concerning national trends towards consolidation among healthcare providers, in addition to longstanding provider payment issues, can complicate the successful implementation of MACRA. Ms. Pittman, what are some of the most effective strategies or practices that have been used to navigate MACRA's requirements in rural settings? And how can these strategies be further supported or expanded to better assist rural healthcare providers and improve patient outcomes, especially among smaller specialty providers?
Thank you for that question. We have 3 members in your district that are really addressing the rural communities in innovative ways. They're doing this through the ACO model. Because of their ability to manage to a total cost of care budget, they can shift resources to the appropriate place and put in technology or solutions that ensures that they're able to remotely communicate with their patients. They rely heavily on telehealth. Telehealth is an area where there has, prior to the flexibility provided during the public health emergency, was a waiver that was allowed in ACOs. We think this is one of those non-financial incentives that brings more providers to APMs because they are able to take advantage of those benefits that help them address their patients differently. I think in terms of some things that we can improve, it gets to how the models are structured and how you define a budget for the population. As Dr. McWilliams said, in rural and underserved communities, we are dealing with a problem of being underserved, and there we are likely going to need to spend more money than we have historically. And the models are based on reducing your costs based on your historical costs. So to bring more rural providers in, I think we have to think about how we set the budget appropriately to address an underserved population.
Thank you. Dr. Daghestani, certainly in recent years, we're seeing more doctors, especially small independent practices, they just simply don't have the resources to comply with all the rules and processes that larger organizations have been able to master. Would you speak to how we better tailor financial incentives and regulatory flexibilities to ensure that we continue to have the smaller independent doctors, especially in rural areas? And would you also speak to how measurements for more how we could move towards more meaningful capture of the patient's experience and health goals in measuring, and maybe metrics like net promoter scores or other patient-facing measures could capture some of that for doctors?
Thank you for the question. So one of the challenges for small practices is the scale. You just might not have enough in your population, might not have enough financial strength to get into MACRA. So we have to recognize that with upfront payment that are done differently for smaller practices and for rural area, that incentivize them to work together, collaborate with others, because it's very difficult for a practice of 2, 3, 4, 10, even a group like ARC or many of our APG members without an upfront investment. So I think that's important. The other point that I'd like to make is the stability and the predictability of the model. One of the biggest challenge for any practice, small practice, is you're not sure what's going to happen to the model next year. Right. So you can invest this year, collect data, build infrastructure, hire nurse navigators, partner with somebody around home health. The payment is delayed a year or two, and then by the time you get to it, the rules have changed. Right. So I think one of the things we have to work on, and we're looking for Congress for guidance, is to go on a 3 or 5 or 7 year where there's more stability and predictability.
Thank you. I want to try to get one last question in here, because traditional Medicare fee-for-service has just simply not been keeping up with medical innovation. And so, Mr. Albanese, I wanted to just address this, whether it's in how Medicare pays for and delivers care, the slow pace of deploying cutting-edge medical drugs and technologies to seniors, the traditional Medicare fee-for-service one-size-fits-all structure prevents the tailoring of benefits and care based upon patients' unique needs. So we've seen with, I'm running out of time here. I'm going to have to ask this for the record, but Medicare Advantage, it isn't perfect, but it has included built-in incentives to pay for value and an incentive for sometimes when the healthcare bureaucracy in DC is absent. So I'll yield back and ask those questions for the record. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Let me initially ask Dr. McWilliams, what changes to Medicare and the wider healthcare system should inform Congress considerations about Medicare payment models that create appropriate incentives for improving access to high-quality care?
Well, when I think about the things that Congress can do, particularly within the context of MACRA, I do think that a continuation of the participation incentive is very important, in part because we have not had yet an era during this phase of payment reform in which we've had both the participation incentives and well-designed APMs that give all providers a chance to participate and prosper financially by providing more efficient care. So having those two act together synergistically will be important, and the APM design has taken time to come around. Just to expand on that just very quickly, one of the major issues in the design of the APMs so far, thinking about ACOs, for example, is that the benchmarks which dictate the total payment or spending, the allowed budget, will sort of chase success. So sort of success begets failure as ACOs lower spending, then in various ways their benchmarks come down. And so they have very little incentive to actually accomplish the main goal of the program. That has been something that CMS has been working on, and as I said in my opening statement, I think is now on a much better track. And so hopefully between better design and the participation incentive, we'll see more success in APMs and more participation. That would be the main thing within the context of MACRA.
Well, thank you. Now, CMS has initiatives underway to ultimately allow all providers to transition to value-based care, including providers in underserved areas and those who serve the most vulnerable. So let me ask you again, Dr. McWilliams, how can Congress or CMS further help more providers transition to value-based care?
Ironically, I think one thing may be eliminating the MIPS. That was intended to help sort of as an on-ramp for providers to start getting used to various aspects of value-based care. There is no rigorous evidence on this in terms of the causal impact of the MIPS on participation, but certainly there is anecdotal evidence that some providers find the MIPS easier, and that the bonuses in the MIPS based, relative to the cost of achieving those bonuses is more appealing than the available opportunities in the APM. So I think that actually would abet or would help participation in the APMs.
Thank you. Let me just ask Dr. Daghestani a related question. I love your name because I know a little bit about Dagestan culture and history, although I've never been there. What types of initiatives have proved to best facilitate the transition to value-based care and to mitigate any challenges providers face in participating in new payment models?
So, initiative taken by Congress and by CMMI, having MACRA initially was a catalyst. Again, I know today we're talking about the challenge of a MACRA, but it has been the catalyst to move those changes. It made many organizations work together. I remember 10, 15 years ago, we were all in our corner, basically. Hospital ran their business, outpatient practices ran their business, specialty ran the business. So the initiative of having group having to work together on total cost of care is important. Investing into infrastructure for IT infrastructure has been critical. Being able to fund that infrastructure where Congress and Medicare can help recognizing some of that infrastructure for population health. For example, a group like Austin Regional Clinic, 400 physicians, invests $7 million a year in infrastructure for population health. That's $70 million over the last 10 years. The return from value-based care on the same Medicare population is $70 million. So we've spent 70, received 70, at a time where we're facing pressure on reimbursement, as well as fatigue in the front line and a shortage of primary care. So I think, again, stability in the model will help us all double down. faster movement from fee-for-service to value is critical. It seems like we have a window where if we move too fast, the system is unstable. But if we move too slow as well, is going to be more unstable. So we have a window to come up with stable and predictable model over the next 3 to 5 years.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. I almost feel like Mark Anthony. I'm here to bury MACRA, not to praise it. But I do feel obligated to mention, since this was an Energy and Commerce Committee product to a large degree, the components of MIPS were all pre-existing quality reporting requirements that had really been developed over several years. And one of the good news aspects was, during the course of the first 3 or 4 years after the passage of MACRA, we did have some implementation and oversight hearings, and removal of meaningful use was one of the accomplishments of that. Meaningful use, of course, was one of the components of MIPS. The other thing that I just have to mention, because every year we had to do a doc fix and keep people from getting a pay cut. And a lot of times, I don't know, Congress seems gridlocked and things aren't happening. So you get a fast-moving train coming through the floor of the House, December of every year. You know it's going to come. You know you can put things on it. So MIPA, PAMI, all of these terrible health policy measures got added to the doc fix at the last minute as Congress would strive to keep from getting the doctors a pay cut. I also need to introduce for the record a letter from the House GOP Doctors Caucus and a letter from Dr. Madera at the AMA, largely supporting our work today of looking into this without objection, so ordered. So it's easy to be chair because you get to do things, and I don't even have to watch the clock as hard when I'm sitting here. Dr. McWilliams, and you did a very good job, and I really appreciate your providing us the basically the one pager on this in your written testimony. Philosophically, the reason that MIPS was there was because of the difficulty that small practices like the Chairman Griffith referenced in his district, the difficulty that small practices would have going to a true APM model, and it was felt that there would be a pathway to a positive update through a MIPS structure. So you've, in your points, I think point number 3 that you've provided us, in expanding and extending the APM, do you see a pathway for that for the smaller practices?
I do, and I think it's vitally important for competition for the success of APMs in the Medicare program. And what we didn't know then, and I think we know now, is that a lot of these smaller organizations and even networks of independent practices have performed quite well as ACOs, for example. So one of my recommendations is to broaden an APM participation bonus to contracts that are one-sided in nature, that don't impose downside risk, that organizations like that are far more comfortable with and have performed well under. I think.
Let me just ask you, do you see a 1 or 2 person practice being able to participate at that level?
Well, so statutorily, I don't think they can alone because there are limits or floors in terms of the number of patients that an organization must serve, for example, to be in the Medicare Shared Savings Program, although the Innovation Center, through its ACO REACH model, considers smaller organizations at smaller thresholds. The problem with those thresholds is growing because of MA's growth. This is just sort of a negative spillover effect. When the Shared Savings Program was started, for example, if you were about 6,600 patients big in terms of Medicare, you qualified. Now you have to be 10,000. So it's risen by an order of magnitude how big you need to be. So we could consider lowering those thresholds.
You'd have to.
Would have to, for sure. And then I think what we've also seen is some actors come in into the arena and convene smaller practices to try to achieve the scale for some of the back office activities to make independent practice participation viable in an ACO program.
So let me ask you another question, because you said you're on the innovation side of Medicare CMMI
I serve in an advising capacity.
Advisory capacity.
Yeah.
Let me advise you, it ain't working. We included in MACRA language for a physician's technical advisory committee to help let the doctors participate. Doctors who have, like thoracic surgeons have registries and oncologists obviously have their registries. To let the doctors participate in the genesis of these models. PTAC unfortunately has been absolutely ignored by the agency, and it's been bipartisan. It's been both Republican and Democratic administrations that have ignored PTAC. But clearly Congress saw a role for PTAC when it created MACRA, and I think we're making a mistake by not encouraging that and utilizing that expertise. And Dr. Daghestani, let me just say, you said the two magic words I didn't want anyone to say, mandate and capitation. Don't even give these guys the idea. The next thing you know, someone will do it. My time has expired. I'm happy to recognize Ms. Chakowski for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you. Dr. McWilliams, I know that this is not a hearing about Medicare Advantage, but it is about how we provide services to our older Americans. And, you were talking about getting rid of MIPS because of the ability then of it being manipulated by some providers to take more money. But if you look at Medicare Advantage, we have seen reports of upcoding, how they make determinations about who is really sick and sicker that have not been verified in order to get more money. I've been very concerned about Medicare Advantage. In fact, I'm co-sponsor of a bill that says you can't use the word Medicare because it's private insurance. And when you say call 1-800, it is not calling Medicare, it is calling a private insurance company. And the things I'm concerned about, because yes, they provide more benefits, they say, but there's also been research that says that if Medicare, traditional Medicare, had the same kind of reimbursements as Medicare Advantage is getting, or get some of that money back, that we could provide dental and hearing and, all those advantages that you supposedly get from Medicare Advantage. How concerned do we need to be about the diminution of traditional Medicare? And what are the consequences that you see and the problems? I'm all for, by the way, making sure that we do all kinds of scrutiny to make sure that we're getting the most for the money, especially for the consumers themselves, for the patients themselves. But is this a problem that we're facing? It seems like you think it is.
I thank you for that question. I definitely think there are some big concerns. I believe that Medicare Advantage and APMs share some things in common in terms of giving whether it's a plan or provider, a fixed payment to take care of a population and therefore allow them more flexibility in how they deliver benefits or care. And that takes advantage of markets as those plans or providers compete for patients and clinicians.
Although, can I just say one thing? My constituent advocates in my office are getting calls from people who are really sick. They got Medicare Advantage because of these additional, but if they got really sick, they were often delayed care, denied care, had to fight for the care.
Yes. And so I was laying out what is generally thought of as the promise or the concept. That is different from the execution. And I think we need to do a much better job of execution, both on the APM side and the MA side, and certainly share your concerns about the higher cost of the Medicare Advantage program. It's been sort of a backdoor way to funnel benefits to seniors instead of providing those benefits directly in some ways. To me, the biggest concern about the rapid growth of Medicare Advantage is that, as you said, it forces the traditional Medicare program to dwindle. It's sort of withering away and at a pretty steady clip now. And that presents some very basic foundational questions about how we want to structure Medicare going forward. There is some promise in Medicare Advantage, I believe, just as there's promise in alternative payment models. But it presents this question of how can we regulate Medicare Advantage and how can we make sure that we're getting added value out of it, because it's not clear we are now. I believe that the best way to do that is to have a stronger traditional Medicare program that presents some competition, and then we know if Medicare Advantage is attracting enrollees, that it is providing an added benefit. And that would involve tighter regulation of some of the things that you mentioned involving risk, paying more for higher coding of diagnoses, the higher risk scores, to make sure that when we set the bar with traditional Medicare, that it's being beat by Medicare Advantage, that we're getting something more.
The one other advantage of traditional Medicare is the issue of the networks. We find that some of the people in Medicare Advantage find that if they travel or, that they may not get reimbursed for things that are not in network, whereas you have much more choice in traditional Medicare. But the gazillion dollars that are spent on advertising by Medicare Advantage, I think, has been really successful in covering up some of the problems that may exist. Well, I'm a big supporter of traditional Medicare, and I appreciate your testimony. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thanks. I think what we ought to start with, what drives a lot of this thinking and what we're trying to do, is you hear people say all the time in the United States, we pay to take care of people when they're sick, and we don't pay care for health. We don't pay to keep people healthy. And that's the design around it. I know traditional Medicare is traditionally fee-for-service. But the problem you get into that we're trying to figure out and what we need help is that it's easy to pay or know what to pay if somebody shows up and needs a leg set because they broke their leg. It's okay, the cast costs this, the set costs this, the surgery costs this. But how do you keep somebody from breaking their leg? I mean, how do you pay for the value of that and the role of the physician? I know physicians don't try to keep people from breaking their leg. I'm just using a simple model to do that. And so when you say value, when you say I'm going to do a blood test, that's different. When you play for value, how do you, and it seems like what we've done is created a way to try to measure value that's created overhead for practices don't participate. I mean, that's the problem. So how do you make it simple enough that your people can participate, but you make it meaningful enough that you know you're getting value? And so the question, I guess, Mr. Albanese had a couple of questions. You kind of answered them in your opening, in your testimony. MACRA was intended to have healthcare providers to be more efficient and to be have better outcomes for their patients and save Medicare money overall. And it seems like we haven't achieved those objectives. And the question is it I asked Dr. Burgess, he's the expert. A lot of this is hard to follow him. Okay. Is it design or is it implementation? And the thing is, it's both. So how do we get the design right and then in the implementation right? Because what we put the 5% APM add-on to try to get people in primary to get into that program, and we're not getting the participant rates that we saw. And I know COVID 2020, I had a thing yesterday and we were measuring something against 2020 standards. And I'm not thinking you can measure anything against 2020 because it's such an odd year moving forward. But so any of you, why are we getting the participation we thought? And I know some of you sort of talked about that. We'll start with Mr. Albanese if you want to talk about that.
Sure, Congressman. So to talk about first the design aspect and then move on to the implementation aspect. From a design perspective, I'm certainly skeptical, and you can see in my written testimony, about the idea of having government definitions of value-based care. As you kind of alluded to, value is a subjective term, and it's one that's best defined by the patient themselves. And so being able to empower patients to seek out the care that is working best for them is an overall design that should be the goal of policymakers. But then when you go into the implementation about how MIPS works now and the hundreds of measures that micromanage the way that clinicians work today, CMS has made indications that it wants to move away from process-based measures, for example, and take away topped-out measures that have no room for improvement, but it's been very slow in that respect. And so I think that having an implementation of an overall vision that moves towards towards that end goal of making measures meaningful to patients. So patients can be the ones to decide how they're going to spend their healthcare dollars. There's been a little back and forth about Medicare Advantage, for example, but for Medicare Advantage plans, those plans are able to bear risk for themselves and construct networks on the basis of value. And I think having more tools like that to give choice to patients is something that would have more of a feedback.
Okay, thanks. I do have another question. I'm sorry, I would like to hear everybody else answer that question, but I'm not going to have time to do that. And the problem is that no matter who defines value, the overhead in collecting what value is, so you know what to pay for. I mean, there's two things. How do you define value, and how do you not be so burdensome you can know what to reimburse the healthcare provider for? So Dr. Daghestani, on that, the reporting requirements on independent community oncology practices is an issue that's been brought to my attention. Do you believe some of the components of MIPS and advanced APMs are leaving independent physician practice susceptible to consolidation, because of the reporting requirements? And has CMS implementation of the law impacted independent physicians' ability to meaningfully drive more value-based care? I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you for the question. So I always, when I'm talking with the health plan, I always talk to them, and I have a saying, do you want us to manage the population, or do you want us to manage the contract? And I think one of the challenges is with ever-moving reporting requirement and changes in the quality measures is we spend a lot of our time and resources and energy managing the contract, and in this case, managing reporting, basically. So it is a heavy lift on rural area, on small practices, as well as on specialty practices specifically, because you don't have that infrastructure, you don't have access to the information. So it does require very heavy investment up front in building that infrastructure and then collecting the data and then submitting the data as well. So in my experience in our area, it has driven actually some significant consolidation between specialty, where we've had 3 urology group, now we're down to 1. We've had multiple GI group, now we're down to 1, which if it's done for the right reason, it is okay to do that. But if it's done for the wrong reason, it can have a dramatic negative impact on our ability to actually produce value care.
Thanks. My time's expired, so I'll yield back. Appreciate your answer. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Duncan, for his 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Whoa, that's somebody's on. Must have been Larry's pacemaker. Okay. We'll try that again.
Stop the clock. I think it's Paul.
All right, so we'll just keep pushing it.
You want to slide over here?
Yeah, do you want to switch chairs? That's probably the best alternative. Yeah, we're going to turn it over to the Technology Subcommittee to solve this problem.
We are the premier technology committee in the United States House of Representatives.
Okay,
Thank you, Chairman.
all right, so
Yeah.
the clock got restarted. You know, I believe that chronic care management is a meaningful, commonplace way to lower patient costs and is a conservative solution, provide higher standard of care for seniors with chronic care needs. That's why I introduced the Chronic Care Management Improvement Act of 2023 with my colleague, Congresswoman from Washington, Ms. Delbane, that removes cost sharing for chronic care management services under Medicare. As our national debt grows and our population ages, I believe investing in Chronic Care Management Improvement Act will ultimately save money for both seniors and the American taxpayer. So Dr. Daghestani, is that right? In your written testimony, you state APG's member groups are committed to engage in the full spectrum of APM and Medicare Advantage. In your experience, and both your role with APG and as a practicing physician, how would chronic care management services benefit your physicians who are members of your organization?
Thank you for the question. So 80% of Medicare spent is probably spent on 20%, which is usually the chronic disease management. And really, to do disease management well, chronic disease, it's team-based care. A single physician cannot achieve that objective alone. You have to partner with others, you have to invest in population health, and you have to build a system around the patients. And that's a significant investment. A few examples from APG members and from my group as well. Again, we take care of about 55,000 Medicare patients, about half of them under MA in a capitated prepaid model, and half of them under an ACO with Medicare. We have a pharmacy team, we have a home visit team, we have care managers. We're partnered with a home health, partnered with hospice, and partnered with a hospital, and partnered with certain specialty group to be able to build the system. So being able to provide chronic care is critical. Getting primary care as well is as important, even though it's 20% of the spend, but every extra dollar spent there can prevent the need to spend a lot of dollar on chronic care as well.
Yeah, absolutely. According to HHS, only 4% of 22 million eligible Medicare patients partake in chronic care management services due to the current payment structure. So, Ms. Pittman, in your written testimony, you stated that Congress should encourage Medicare Advantage plans to enter risk-bearing arrangements and APMs that encourage more value-based care to help manage chronic care illnesses and quality access to care. So how would eliminating the chronic care management cost-sharing requirement under Medicare impact APMs and the quality of care given to each patient that that are primarily seniors?
Yeah, so one of the things ACOs do currently is offer the chronic care management outside of billing for it because of the cost-sharing piece. And so one of the things that we'd want to see as an additional flexibility for ACOs is to be able to waive beneficiary cost sharing. So our members are doing risk arrangements with the MA plans, and then they're in ACOs. In the MA plans, they're able to provide that chronic care management without cost sharing. If they do it in an ACO and want to get paid for it, then they have to, then the cost sharing comes in, or they just provide it on their own and don't bill for it from their shared savings, or this is another way that they use those advanced APMs. So eliminating the cost sharing, giving ACOs more flexibility to waive patient cost sharing just opens up the flexibilities and what else they can do and continue to innovate and provide additional services.
I agree. So I'm hopeful that my colleagues on Energy and Commerce Committee will consider the Chronic Care Management Improvement Act as a way to lower patient costs and improve health outcomes for our seniors. So great answers. Appreciate your feedback. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Mr. Palmer of Alabama for his 5 minutes of questioning. You could stay up here on the top row. You've got enough seniority to keep up here. There you go.
I'm going to start out asking what it would cost to get better technology for our hearings. I do have some questions along the same lines as everybody else. And Dr. Albanese, in your testimony, you mentioned concerns about CMMI's lack of transparency in its operations decision-making. Can you provide some specific examples?
Certainly, Congressman. So the studies that I had cited in my testimony kind of allude to this a bit, but the overall findings from CMMI's own analysis of its first decade of models and of its operations looked at over 50 models. Those aren't all APMs that are eligible for the bonuses under MACRA, but even with that broader pool, only about 6 of those had yielded net savings, and very few have yielded significant quality improvements. Many of the advanced APMs that did yield quality improvements in turn did not yield net savings. So that's a track record from their own analysis that you're not achieving the goals that it had set out to achieve.
But payments were made nonetheless, even though would you consider those payments that were made, would you classify those as improper payments?
I would say that the payments that are being made are not transforming the value of care as they were promised.
Right, so the amounts paid should have been lower. If you're not achieving the objectives, they wouldn't have qualified for that level of payments, what I'm saying. So
Yes.
So that could be classified as an improper payment.
I would say that the analysis that has been done of CMMI, it's been far above what's been projected. And so you're correct that it has been costing more than it should have been saving.
The reason I bring that up is because we've got an enormous issue with improper payments. I think in the last GAO report, it was about $47 billion, and it's been mentioned in the opening statements here about the pressure on Medicare, particularly it's going to almost double. I think it was you that made that point. So if we're looking at new payment models, alternative payment models, and Ms. Pittman, you mentioned the same thing about the lack of transparency. I think we have to address some of the other things, underlying issues related to these models, so that people are getting paid what they should get paid. At the same time, we're incentivizing a higher quality of care. Does that make sense in the context of what we're talking about here? That we want to make sure that we're not spending more money than we should, and that the money that we do have goes where it needs to go. Ms. Pittman?
Yeah, I think one of the things in the study that he's referencing of looking at all CMMI models, their cost savings were just very minimal, that they didn't meet the criteria to want to expand it much more rapidly. I think if we really want to improve the CMMI approach, there are lessons learned from those models in terms of flexibilities and things like providing upfront payments to providers to get started on the value transition that have been proven to save money, and we should rapidly expand all of those. I think what the evaluations are missing, part of the lack of transparency is we don't know how CMS is going to evaluate a model for if it should be expanded or not. The evaluations just look at cost savings and quality. There are other factors that aren't known. We want to have more transparency around those factors. Perhaps it's an opportunity to take it through like public rulemaking once, just to make that really clear. And then we want to look at other factors like, is this model retaining access in rural communities? Is this model bringing in specialists or other providers that typically haven't participated in the past? So there's opportunity to really
I want to get one more question here, Dr. Daghestani. And I grew up in a rural area and very concerned about the access to health care because it's a huge problem in Alabama. But in addition to greater transparency, Dr. Daghestani, in the model development process, how should Congress and the administration think about the wide range of overlapping CMMI models and the potential burden and uncertainty that they place on providers, and particularly rural providers?
So I think, we're appreciative of CMS and CMMI's offer to creating those models, but I feel like we're at the second stage of MACRA right now, where we need to simplify the model. We need to factor rural area, we need to factor small practices, medium, and then large multi-state practices, and come up with less models that are fixed for a longer point of time frames. We're not going on a sprint. We're looking at it as a marathon. I think we've been in multiple sprints, and we're ready to get into a marathon situation where we say, here's the outcome. We have these fewer model, we have this financial predictability, and this quality measure predictability.
My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and now recognize the gentlelady of Florida, Ms. Kamick, for her 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this very important hearing today. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing before us. I'll jump right in. Mr. Albanese, CMS has not taken meaningful steps to develop advanced alternative payment models, APMs, options for specialty practices. And I know we've been kind of dancing around this a little bit today. The current system tends to focus on primary care rather than the specialty providers like GI. You mentioned that earlier. As a result, not all specialties benefit in the same way that primary care providers do. So in your view, how can CMS alter the current MACRA framework to include non-primary care specialty practices?
Well, I think to echo what Ms. Pittman mentioned before, a lot of it deals with what we know about the decision-making process in CMMI, which is not a lot. I think there needs to be more transparency in that. And I think actually what might be a better approach is to have more broad-based models that try to simplify the measures and the incentives that doctors face. I can turn to MIPS for an example as a way to describe APMs. There's hundreds of different measures within that micromanage the activities of doctors. And if you have too many models that are going to be prioritizing what the priorities of government officials selecting those measures and designing those models are, you're necessarily going to be missing out on different priorities that are not included or that patients themselves might find most relevant.
Well, and Dr. Daghestani, you had touched on this a little bit. Do you want to follow up on that? Thank you.
Yeah, I think for specialty, it has been a challenge. I think in a multi-specialty group, our specialists have been really engaged because they have dramatic impact on the site of service, which is something we at some point have to talk about, is how do we work in a way to ensure that hospitals are supported for the chronic care that they provide, but at the same time, we're making sure that the site of service aspect, which impact quality and cost dramatically. And I think that will engage the specialists. If we have more clarity on site of service discussion and how that impact the ACO performance or specialty model, I think that will be an important next step.
I appreciate it. I'd like to yield the remainder of my time to my good friend from the great state of Texas, Dr. Burgess.
Thank you. And I just had one additional question, Dr. McWilliams, before I ran out of time. With your unique position being both an advisor to CMMI and your study of the APMs, what additional flexibility do you think CMMI needs to provide to the APMs to see them more functional, particularly in the role for smaller practices?
So I think there are some waivers or flexibilities that could be helpful, particularly in the context of rural areas. If we think about the APM concept as giving providers the flexibility to meet patient needs, that's really critical in an area where you really have to step away from sort of bricks and mortar medicine in order to make it work. So certainly that should be a goal and would deserve some careful thought, I think, about how we handle telemedicine. There's a tension between sort of innovating in care delivery and then putting every innovation in the fee schedule, and then it's really hard to price, and then we get really innovative in delivering care, and the unit of care gets very vague, and we run the risk of just sort of increasing more and more use. That's the conceptual promise of an APM, is to have a general payment for a population so that then providers can figure out how to best arrange the care. So in order to do that, while there may be some flexibilities that are useful or some waivers, in the end, I believe it's really the backbone of these models that we need to design better in setting the benchmarks in a way that providers don't get penalized for success and sets them to grow in a way that allows all providers a chance to prosper in the models. That becomes a very weedy conversation fast, one that I have a lot and would be happy to have,
Yes, sure.
but can't be done in 52 seconds. But that, I believe, is generally the crux of the issue and where there has been a lot more movement recently, particularly in the shared savings program, in trying to address that.
Well, and you're right, that can be part of a longer conversation. I'd actually look forward to that. One of the criticisms that I received because of the high number of people who could succeed into the MIPS program, someone cynical at the time at one of the agencies says, why don't you just call that the Every Doctor Gets an A program? But the answer to that is you want your doctor to be successful, right? When I go to my doctor, I want them to be successful. So I appreciate your thoughts on that. There perhaps can be some opportunities for further discussion, but I thank the gentlelady from Florida for yielding. I'll yield back.
I yield.
Gentleman yields back to the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize Mr. Ruiz of California. Do you need a second?
Thank you.
Now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Ruiz, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you for holding this important hearing today. I grew up, practiced medicine, and now represent an area of Southern California where I grew up that has always struggled with adequate access to health care. Add chronic access challenges to the growing provider shortage, and then add record numbers of people entering the Medicare system, and we have a recipe for disaster, okay? My primary concern is access to care for our seniors. Of course, there are many ways in which we need to address this issue, including the creation of a more robust healthcare workforce. But today, I want to talk about fair payments to our physicians who provide care for our seniors. Medicare payment rates have declined over time despite the increasing cost in running a medical practice. In fact, if you take into account inflation in medical practice, payments to doctors have declined 26% between 2001 and 2023. This makes it difficult for small, rural, and low-income serving population physician practices to keep their doors open, further exacerbating the existing physician shortages and leading providers to turn away Medicare patients. In fact, nonpartisan government stakeholders have also expressed concerns about the failure of Medicare payments to keep pace with the rising costs of running a medical practice and the damaging impact it could have on patient access to care. The Medicare trustees and MedPAC have called for legislative action to address the Medicare physician payment system by providing physicians with an annual inflation-based update tied to the Medical Economic Index. A March 2023 report from the Medicare trustees state that the trustees, quote, expect access to Medicare participating physicians to become a significant issue in the long term, end of quote, if Congress doesn't take steps to bolster the payment system. That's why I introduced the bipartisan H.R. 2474, the Strengthening Medicare for Patients and Providers Act, with my colleagues, Dr. Bouchon, the A-Team, Miller-Meeks, and Barra. This bill addresses payments to Medicare providers to help prevent a possible physician shortage for Medicare beneficiaries. It does this by providing an annual Medicare physician payment update tied to inflation as measured by the Medicare Economic Index to more appropriately take into account the cost of running a medical practice to help ensure that payments to doctors are adequate so that they can continue to see patients. So, Dr. McWilliams, what is the effect on patients, providers, and the strength of the Medicare system when doctors are not properly reimbursed to make their bottom lines meet?
Thanks very much for that question, which is a big one. I think about this a little bit more in distributional terms than absolute terms, insofar as there are underserved populations for whom more resources would be beneficial, and then we also have an overspending problem as well. So there seems to be certainly the prospect of reducing wasteful care and converting that into additional care for patients who need it. I think there is a difference between talking about how to set updates for fees and how to set updates for benchmarks, whether that's for MA plans or for alternative payment models. We've spent a lot of this discussion today talking about participation incentives in alternative payment models.
So I think that alternative payment models was the experimental experience that we wanted to get to the best way to create incentives to produce a better health. When Medicare in general isn't paying the doctors enough to keep their doors open, then doctors are going to be less inclined to take Medicare, and the patients ultimately are not going to have access to those doctors. The cost of care has been increasing. Congress has been cutting rates. It hasn't even been going up over the several years, and so we have a recipe for failure for seniors not getting access to care, and that's my primary concern. And so this is about tying the payments to that inflation that continues to go up, so there's not this end-of-year crisis trying to figure out how they're going to get paid, which puts in jeopardy a lot of practices. How do these inefficiencies you've identified in the payment systems developed under MACRA threaten to worsen health disparities, and what approaches can we take to promote more equitable health outcomes?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And if we take it to the extreme, if fees get so low that there's a loss with every service provided, obviously providers can never catch up. The point I was trying to make is that how this plays out does differ under the two types of payment systems, whether it's fee-for-service or an alternative payment model that sets a fixed payment and then to grow at a rate, in that providers are no longer penalized with less revenue if they do fewer things that are reimbursed, and can spend more of their time and resources in doing things like expanding access. So I do believe that payment reform is rather crucial to preserving access, particularly for underserved populations, and that because the rate of fee growth affects the rate of participation in these other models, we do need to think carefully about how we inflate fees. And then within APMs, we need to think carefully about how we grow benchmarks, but the two are related.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from Indiana, Dr. Bouchon, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you. First of all, I want to associate myself with the comments of Dr. Ruiz. I couldn't agree more, and we have bipartisan legislation we're working on to solve some of those challenges. I do want to thank the full committee chair, Ms. Rogers, and subcommittee chair Griffith for scheduling what I consider a critical hearing for the future of health care in the United States. I know that sounds a little big, but I'm telling you, this is a big problem we have to address. The entire premise of MACRA, of course, which was passed in law in 2015, was to move us away from the old model for reimbursement of physicians that was driven by volume and transition us to a system where providers were reimbursed based on their ability to deliver high-quality care. Why was this important? In fee-for-service model, the best provider is reimbursed at the same level as a provider that may be providing less quality care. I've never thought that was right. It also leaves volume as the only dial a provider can turn to impact reimbursement. Unfortunately, as is all too common in D.C., in my opinion, the executive branch under both political parties has failed to fully implement the law in an adequate fashion, and in some cases not even bothered to really try and implement the law, like ignoring PTAC, for example, as was mentioned. I mean, there are massive problems that we see in the MIPS program and the alternative payment models, primarily that these programs are somewhat overly bureaucratic and make it difficult for smaller practices, particularly in independent or rural practices, to participate, as has been mentioned. This is not my opinion, by the way, as was mentioned. 2 GAO reports have said this. Dr. McWilliams, the MIPS program is budget neutral, correct? What I mean by that is whoever gets bonuses, you have to have people getting cuts, right?
That's my understanding.
Right, and honestly, I don't think that half the providers in America are providing poor quality care, but essentially it's a budget neutral program. Everybody that goes positive, you have to have just as many negative. That was a fundamental flaw at the time, but I couldn't do anything about it. I tried. These factors and other reimbursement inequities, as was mentioned by Dr. Ruiz, like a lack of inflationary update for physician reimbursement, is just devastating, not even keeping up with practice costs. In addition, I just want to say this, it's helped lead to the morale amongst providers being extremely low. That's not my opinion. I talked to doctors who I've known for decades. And the burnout is high, and we're losing quality people, particularly in rural America. I was a practicing heart surgeon for over 15 years, served as president of my medical group, and I can tell you from firsthand experience the lack of proper reimbursements for physicians will ultimately result in our constituents having access challenges to quality, affordable health care, regardless of where you live. I agree with Dr. Ruiz. My issue, everybody should have access to quality, affordable health care. Reimbursement is a substantial challenge. So unfortunately, while we repealed the sustainable growth rate formula, many physicians continue to experience steep cuts, and the legislation that was previously mentioned would help mitigate some of that. Everybody else in the healthcare system gets these updates. I don't know if people know that. Physicians don't, hospitals do, others do. They get updates based on inflation. So we have to fix that. I want to touch on a different subject, though. Dr. Daghestani, my specialty, cardiothoracic surgery, and others, such as neurosurgery and orthopedic surgery, have established clinical data outcome registries, the STS database, for 30 years. Valuable tools to support performance assessment and value-based care models. Unfortunately, these registries cannot realize their full power without better access to Medicare cost data. In the 117th Congress, I introduced Meaningful Access to Federal Health Plan Claims Data Act to help remedy this situation and make access to Medicare claims data more readily available. Furthermore, CMS has failed to take advantage of these data registries, in my opinion, and the Qualified Clinical Data Registries reporting program needs an overhaul. Do you believe that CMS needs to reimagine how it supports physician-led clinical data registries, including improving access to cost data?
Yeah, I think data is not only important, it's critical. None of us can survive in an ACO world if we don't have access to timely and accurate data. You're taking a risk at a time where physician reimbursement is down, physician morale is down, number of physicians going into medical school is flattened, especially for primary care and some medical subspecialties. So I think it's critical to work with CMS and CMMI on having meaningful access to data and be a stakeholder and be at the table. Groups like APG could provide a lot of insight. We're working as well as group with our members of 360+ group to organize our data and to be able to share that data and publish study, because without that knowledge, without knowing what works and what doesn't work, we're not going to be able to prove and refine those models.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize Dr. Miller Meeks for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm proud to be a sponsor of H.R. 2474, the Strengthening Medicare for Patients and Providers Act, with Dr. Bouchon, Ruiz, and Barra. This critical legislation would add an annual inflationary update to physician payments under Medicare. While operating costs for medical practice have gone up by 47%, physician payments have declined 26% from 2001 to 2023 when adjusted for inflation, making it difficult for small, rural, and low-income serving practices to provide care to patients across America. It underscores the morale that was mentioned earlier, and also the increasing scope of practice by lower educated providers also puts additional pressure. Our bill stabilizes physician payments year to year and seeks to preserve access to care, which has only worsened since the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Daghestani, in your opinion, do you believe that stabilizing physician payments by providing an inflationary update to docs nationwide will benefit patients?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we're talking about physician a lot, but as a practicing physician, I'm really talking about my patients. If my door is not open, if groups at APG's door is not open, so the physician payment, yes, it's about physician, but at the end of the day is being able. And we have to keep in mind that all commercial reimbursement is tied to Medicare. So the impact is triple and quadruple on physicians. So anything that we can do to stabilize that will be important, and anything that we can invest in the movement toward being accountable for the total cost of care and total outcome will be critical as well.
Thank you. Mr. Albanese, in 2015, Medicare program spend was $646 billion, with ACO savings reported at $145 million. $145 million might sound high, but it reflects 0.0002% savings in total Medicare program spending for that year. Similarly, from 2016 to 2018, Medicare program spend totaled $2.128 trillion, with ACO savings reported as $358 million, which reflects 0.0001% savings in total Medicare spending for that time frame. Not minimal, but still much smaller than I think is reflected. Do you think ACOs have been effective at reducing Medicare expenditures? As we evaluate reforms to MACRA, what should Congress consider when reforming ACO models?
So I certainly think that the models that have actually saved some nominal amount of money has been nominal in their savings, as you alluded to. And I think that the concerns that we should be focused on as policymakers and policy analysts is that, first of all, trying to alleviate the incentives towards more consolidation and having bigger providers being able to succeed more successfully in these programs is something that has happened all across MACRA. And ACOs are good in theory in terms of trying to have more accountability for the total cost of care among providers, but when filtered through different government rules and different iterations of the shared savings program, this turns out to not actually play out as was expected and as has happened with other CMMI models and other models besides CMMI.
Thank you, and you led into my next question, Dr. McWilliams. The physician clinical ownership and employee landscape has dramatically changed in the past decade. Private medical practices of all sizes and specialties are being bought and consolidated with larger hospital systems and groups at alarming rates. How do these buyouts and mergers and ACOs and lack of inflationary cost adjustments impact the ability of physicians to participate in new and innovative alternative payment models and stay in practice to give high-quality patient care in their communities versus an independent practice?
Thank you for that question. I think in the theme of today of trying to streamline the portfolio of models and design, have fewer models designed better, I think what we want to move towards is having these APMs make participation worthwhile for independent practices and allow them to remain independent in terms of ownership. Healthcare consolidation is a massive problem. It has a lot of bad consequences for patients, including limiting their options of where they can go. We have evidence that it worsens the quality of healthcare delivery, raises prices, and there's no reason why APMs should not encourage smaller organizations and allow them to thrive. In fact, it should be, payment reform can be pro-competitive if designed correctly.
Excuse me, to that end, there was a 5% incentive payment to encourage providers, and in December of 2022, Congress passed a pared-down one-year 3.5% extension of MACRA's incentive payments. If Congress allows these incentives to expire, what will be the impact on the movement to value-based payment models?
I'm glad you brought that up because this ties into the point about consolidation. The way that bonus is designed, as I said in my opening statement, is as a proportion of revenue. So it favors the bigger organizations. For a primary care group that could participate in an ACO model, it's a very small bump. And so I think we need to have an even playing field in terms of the participation incentives if we care about competition.
Yeah. And often not passed to physicians themselves. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Dr. Schreier of Washington for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chair Griffith, and thank you for allowing me to wave onto this committee. I wanted to thank the witnesses who are here today as well. The Medicare Access and CHIP Reauthorization Act, MACRA, was passed in 2015, long before my time in Congress. But as a physician, I could see what a big deal this was, to just change the thinking about how we deliver health care in this country, and incentivizing health and value-based care, not fee-for-service, which can rack up costs. But of course, we need to make sure we're doing it right and offering the same incentives or adequate incentives, and folding doctors into the program, and then getting good outcome measurements. So in some cases, MACRA has not worked as fast or as well as we've wanted it to, but in other cases, it can really be life-changing. So I wanted to share a good ACO story. In my state of Washington has been a leader on this issue and very innovative. And there's a gentleman from my state, Michael, who has multiple sclerosis and was doing terribly. In a fee-for-service model, he would have had trouble getting to appointments, costs would have been high, but there were other complicating factors. Very challenging living situation on multiple levels, lots of risks. And the model employed by a local ACO in Washington state called Northwest Momentum Health Partners were able to get enough wraparound services that they relocated him to a safer home, got him a low-cost phone, arranged for transportation to his doctor's appointments, and as a result, his health has been in much better shape. And so I wanted to highlight a success story. We also need to make sure that incentives line up and keep doctors and hospitals involved. Ms. Pittman, in your experience, I would just love to hear your thoughts on how incentive payments can move the needle on patient care, and maybe how we could update MACRA to allow for more providers to be incentivized and have more creative solutions like the one used in Michael's case. Thank you for that question. I think that's an excellent example of how clinicians are using those incentive payments. It's going right back to reinvestment in care. The advanced APM incentives go directly to the clinician practice, not to the ACO. So the clinicians can design what services or approaches that they see best for their practice. So that has been a tremendous help. In terms of designing it for the future, I think you hear from many of us, these incentives have worked, but there are some challenges with them. Part of how the thresholds to qualify for the incentives discourages bringing in certain types of providers like specialists, or if you bring in rural providers like a rural health clinic or a critical access hospital, it decreases your ability to meet the thresholds to qualify for that incentive. And so we would need to rethink how we set qualifications for the incentives. The incentives also are only for the downside risk APMs, and we need to recognize the movement for the folks that are not held for risk as well. And so designing an incentive so perhaps that there is, our suggestion is you want to have adequate payment for all clinicians, Then beyond that, having incentives, maybe it's a smaller incentive for those that are doing the non-risk bearing and a higher incentive for those that are taking on risk.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. I also wanted to ask about CMMI and CMS innovation. And they've tested dozens of these value care-based models. You referred to some of the trickier spots there. Some of these demonstrations have really expanded our understanding about how to shift payment and improve patient outcomes. But only a few models have met the criteria for expansion. And I'm not sure if the lessons learned are always translated into existing models or how to improve models. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, Ms. Pittman, about CMMI translating lessons and, also just what can we do to spur more innovation in addition to payment incentives?
Yeah, so in terms of translating the lessons, if we take something like there are 2 other ACO models that have been tested by the Innovation Center. One was the next generation ACO, one is the current model, ACO REACH. They both have an approach where you shift primary care payment away from fee-for-service to providing a per beneficiary population-based amount. And that allows more investment into primary care, which we all know is much needed. That's not something that's in the permanent ACO model Medicare shared savings. We know that it has worked. We know that the next-gen ACOs that took on that option have higher savings than those that did not, and the REACH model requires that. So that's an example of an innovation that we think should just automatically come over into the shared savings program. I'm encouraged that CMS seems to be working on that approach. I think some of the challenges with what the models and meeting the criteria for expansion is, we just don't know what the criteria for expansion is. We know that the evaluations look at cost savings and quality, but there are other factors that go into whether or not a model should meets the actuarial requirements to be expanded in all of Medicare. So we think that should be made public, have more transparency around what the criteria are, and then take a look at other things that might want to go into the criteria, like is it retaining access in rural or other communities?
Thank you. I yield back and dissociate myself with comments from Representative Miller-Meeks about matching payment for physicians to inflation. Thank you very much.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize Dr. Joyce of Pennsylvania for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you for yielding, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to wave on to this important hearing. I would ask unanimous consent to enter 2 statements into the record, one from the Surgical Coalition and one from the American College of Surgeons.
And we'll take that up at the end, but assuming there'll be no objection.
Thank you. Small independent doctors play a crucial role in our healthcare system, particularly in rural and underserved areas. However, there are concerns that MACRA's requirements may disproportionately burden these providers and potentially exacerbate existing healthcare disparities, such as consolidation of practices and availability for care. A central goal of MACRA was to move away from a fee-for-service healthcare model to a system of value-based payment through the use of alternative payment models. But unfortunately, many specialty physicians wishing to move beyond fee-for-service will find that not a single physician-focused alternative payment model is available because none of the models approved by the Physician-Focused Payment Model Technology Advisory Committee, PTAC, have been tested. While numerous proposals have been recommended for testing or implementation by the PTAC, CMMI has not moved forward on any of them. Dr. Daghestani, how can Congress move the needle to make sure that value-based models for specialty medicine are put into practice?
Thank you for the question. So I think one of the things we need to think about, especially with rural practice, is one, the threshold that a rural practice needs to meet to enter an ACO arrangement. I think that's critical. We talked about upfront investment, that maybe the value of that investment in rural practices need to be higher. There are additional things that we haven't covered today. Telemedicine plays a big role in rural practice. Stability and predictability of what's going to happen to telemedicine is going to be critical. Being able to recruit physicians for rural practices right now, patients in rural areas, where I used to practice in rural Oklahoma, they use urgent care for chronic care, and they use ER for urgent care stuff, and then they delay preventive, and they delay significant issue as well. So the workforce, expanding coverage is something we have to think about, because Medicare could be a small percent of the practice, and then you have a huge percentage of underinsured or uninsured completely, and that have an impact. So we have to figure out, as we engage small practices, specialty or primary care in rural area, of how we support the rest of the population with expanding coverage as well.
I think you bring into the conversation the need for telemedicine in rural areas. I too practiced in rural part of central Pennsylvania, but the availability for broadband is a concern. That's for a different hearing, and we will address that as well. The impact of MACRA should be noticed in the quality of care our seniors receive. MACRA should also lead to savings due to a decrease in volume of unnecessary services. However, for small and independent physicians, this has been challenging, and in some cases may lead to further provider consolidation. Mr. Albanese, you mentioned in your testimony that MACRA has accelerated the trend of hospital acquisition of physician practices. Could you further elaborate on the specific impact of this trend on small and independent practices?
Thank you, Congressman. The scores that we've seen on average from small providers and small practices compared to large ones have been significantly lower in MIPS. And that indicates, on one hand, that the fixed costs and the cost constraints they face are more difficult to bear, but it also means that they have fewer resources to navigate the complexities of that system. So these lead to, as I mentioned, lower scores, less of an ability to get a payment bump, and more incentives for consolidation due to trying to...
Let's continue with that consolidation concept that you brought back into the conversation. Does this consolidation affect the ability to participate in value-based care models? And what modifications, what adjustments to MACRA do you believe would support these practices?
Having less burden overall in MACRA through MIPS and through APMs would go a long way. I think CMS's approach so far has been to try and exempt more practices from MIPS in order to alleviate that burden, but it leaves them back in fee-for-service with the old incentives and without incentives for value-based care. So being able to simplify that and try to move more towards a system where the quality of doctors is best expressed through market mechanisms of patients picking their own care, and possibly through intermediaries such as private payers and Medicare Advantage is one option, and trying to shift away from having the government determine what value means through hundreds of different measures in MIPS.
Couldn't agree with you more that shifting away from government determining what the value of a specific physician or practice is so important. Thank you for those comments. My time has expired, and I yield.
Gentleman yields back, and now recognize Ms. Lesko for the vice chair of this subcommittee for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first of all, I have to apologize for being gone for a while, so I haven't heard what questions were asked. And so excuse me if I'm re-asking a question you already answered. Mr. Albanese, MACRA's incentive structure is a critical component of our efforts to transition to value-based care. However, we need to ensure that these incentives are sufficient and effectively targeted to encourage providers to improve care quality and reduce costs. In your testimony, you mentioned the need to revise MACRA's incentive structure to make payments more sustainable. Could you elaborate on your suggestion? What specific changes or adjustments would you propose to enhance the effectiveness of the incentive structure?
Certainly, Congresswoman. I know that there have been, previously there has been discussion about other ways to reform payments, such as by indexing to inflation. It's a little bit beyond the scope of my testimony to comment specifically on that, but I would simply urge a couple things to keep in mind. First of all, the overall fiscal situation. Part B is the fastest growing part of Medicare, even with the changes to physician payments that have slowed that growth rate. So there's still policy changes that can exacerbate that situation. And I think going back to the example of other payment systems outside the physician fee schedule, because that is updated very uniquely under MACRA, there are still opportunities for mispricing and overpayment in those systems, and a system where the federal government is setting payment every year is not going to necessarily perfectly predict the economic value of services. So just trying to not emulate the worst abuses of those payment systems and return to that fee-for-service framework, that coupled with the fiscal sustainability would be the principles I would keep in mind.
Thank you. Ms. Pittman, from your perspective, what changes, if any, would you suggest to MACRA's incentive structure to better support the transition to value-based care within ACOs?
Yeah, I think one of the things that has been very effective is the incentive payments to move to value, how we would want to, there are some challenges with that, and we would want to see some restructuring. One of the baseline things would be to ensure that all clinicians have adequate payment. Even when you're in an APM, the payments it's based on historical payment, so whatever physicians are paid in fee-for-service defines APM benchmarks. From there, we want to see incentives for those that move to APMs, whether they're risk-bearing or not, and shifting it slightly from the way that it's structured today. I think ultimately we also would want to see more flexibility. That's the non-financial incentive, so more ability to provide additional services beyond what is allowed in Medicare. Medicare Advantage has that benefit of doing additional services, and we would want to see the clinicians participating in ACOs or other APMs to be able to provide some of those flexibilities.
Thank you, and thank you for all of you being here, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Seeing there are no further members wishing to ask questions, I would like to thank our witnesses for being here today. You all did a fantastic job. I'm also going to take a brief moment to go on a little tirade about our microphones. The committee does not actually control the microphones. That's the Congressional Recording Office. They have advised us as we were going through this hearing, that they don't have the parts to fix that microphone. It seems to me that the committee overseeing technology ought to be able to override the Congressional Recording Office or recording studios, that we need to get that fixed. This room was not used during COVID because it wasn't wired to do the Zoom type calls, but certainly we should have microphones that work. So there's my tirade. We'll be working on it, and hopefully next time we won't have to play musical chairs in the committee that oversees technology for a hearing. With that being said, I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record documents included on the staff hearing documents list, which includes both the documents that Dr. Burgess requested and the documents that Dr. Joyce requested. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to committee rules, I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record, and I ask that the witnesses submit their response within 10 business days upon receipt of the questions. And without objection, the committee is adjourned. But if we know, both councils agree, if there's a member of the committee that's trying to get here, we will ask some additional questions or make some additional comments to give time. Because you had about a minute and a half.
Yeah, they told me, so I had just finished asking a question, where are we? Downstairs, to the EPA guy.
Right.
And then Brendan said, John Joyce is up right now.
Yeah.
Go up there, and he put his arm in a closing, it was like this.
That's why I say, just get somebody on your team to tell us that you're going to be here within 2 to 3 minutes. Obviously, we can't wait a half an hour, but if you're on your way, you're finishing questions up downstairs, we'll work to keep the hearing open. Yeah.
I said, I want to see your math.
and not have any increase in usage. Well, because what they're playing is everybody's gonna get on buses, electric buses, or trains. The problem is, same problem I have with the rules here on flights. You can't fly on a private plane unless you pay the commercial rate, or you get the charter rate. I have no commercial airports in my district, not a single one, not one.